Yeah, I'm a wanderer, so I'm glad I don't have to be tethered. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I have just kind of one central message I want to get across tonight, and that is, as you've heard through the course of this open course, we know that climate change is happening. We know that we're committed to climate change. The question no longer is climate change happening? It's no longer, is climate change having impacts on ecosystems and socioeconomic systems? We know it is. The main question is, where will these impacts most likely occur? With what magnitude? How much can we predict these changes? And then what do we do about it to prepare? As Matthias just said, we're committed to change. I'm sure you've spoken about this, but the two main areas of work right now are in mitigation. This is where we've been up to this point, where a lot of the focus has been on mitigation. The way to kind of think about this is, how much do we invest in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions today in order to stave off the worst impacts for our children and grandchildren? But we're moving towards a strategy of adaptation as well, where we recognize that climate change is going to happen despite our best efforts. So how do we prepare society for those coming changes? This isn't as easy as you might expect. I'm going to give you a biologist's perspective of this. So I'm going to take some of the physical changes as a given and then discuss how we can use our knowledge of biology to understand where natural and human managed ecosystems are most likely to occur. So this is a graph that I suspect you've seen a lot over the past couple weeks, showing past change and projected change, in this case in sea level estimates. The question then becomes, how as citizens, as policymakers, as decision makers, do we plan for the future? As Matthias said, I just moved here from South Carolina. We're often the butt of many jokes, so we reveled in the fact that North Carolina for once was in the news. You may have heard that North Carolina outlawed sea level rise. The way this works is the argument was made that future projections of sea level rise can only be based on the observations of what we've seen up to this point. So if you follow that logic, and I love this one by Stephen Colbert, I've been alive my entire life, therefore I always will be. And he takes this further to say, if you extrapolate from the critical periods of ages 8 to 12, I will grow to over 14 feet tall. This is about as far as we can get based on simple observations of the past, simple extrapolations from the past. But the question then is, how do we understand enough of the mechanisms that drive this to make viable predictions about the future in order to act on them? Do we really have a scenario like this where the rate of change will be comparable to what we've seen, or do we experience acceleration, which is what all our models are predicting? So really what I want to talk to you about today is how in the kind of ecological field do we make predictions of the future when the only way to really test this is based on our understanding and our observations of the past. If you're a PhD student, this could be very bad news. You don't want to set up a series of experiments that 30 years from now you get the answer to find out if you get your PhD or not. So somehow we have to come up with smart ways of developing models that draw on our experience from the past, that draw on from our observations, and then give us reasonable predictions with acceptable levels of uncertainty for the future. And I just want to be clear, I'm not talking about making predictions that are very, very explicit. I'm not saying that we're going to effectively make weather predictions 20 years into the future, nor am I saying we're going to have any real predictive power 100 years in the future. What I'm really talking about is, what are the probabilities of, or the most likely and least likely impacts going to be? And probably most importantly from an ecological viewpoint, how do we know what we don't know? How do we predict surprises, or how do we prevent surprises? By understanding the mechanisms through which these human natural ecosystems occur. So climate change adaptation, from where I stand as a biologist, is how do we predict the most likely and least likely impacts? And from a biological viewpoint, how do we predict the winners and losers? And specifically, how do we go beyond the use of these generalizations? These are things that you've heard a lot in the news media. We tend to talk about climate change in terms of these kind of sweeping generalizations. So for example, you hear about species ranges moving towards the poles. You hear about altitudinal shifts, where plant species will move higher up in elevation in response to changing environmental conditions. And statistically, this certainly is true. when we look at kind of the large-scale data sets, these are the general trends that we see. But there are also lots and lots of exceptions to this. So the central question I kind of want to pose is, are these generalizations sufficient for what we need to know in order to adapt to climate change, to make predictions that we can act upon? And you probably guessed that my answer to this is going to be no. So it's just one example. Funding is always limiting. Imagine a scenario where we have 5 potential sites for a marine protected area. You can make the same argument in a terrestrial area. And we only have enough funding or enough political willpower in order to enact one of these protected sites. How from a purely ecological viewpoint, not even adding in all the other aspects of national security and economic security into this, how from a purely ecological viewpoint do we select which of these sites we should use for a marine protected area? Ideally, what you'd like is to find a place that's not only healthy now, but will be healthy 20 years in the future. You don't want to throw good money after bad. Putting a protected area in a site where, despite your best efforts, it's going to go down the tubes in the next 10 years. And I mean, this is often a controversial statement. I mean, oftentimes the way we think about conservation is we try to protect as much as we absolutely can and then hold the line. But this kind of triage is another way to view it, that we focus our energy, we focus our willpower and political efforts and finances on the place where we have the best chance of preserving ecosystems into the future. That may mean that we have to sacrifice some of these sites. There are sites now that no matter what we do in terms of our best efforts, probably will not be around in the next 10 or 20 years. We're seeing that a lot in coral reefs right now. The one that is kind of on the edge, this is one where I find most interesting. As you've hopefully heard in this course, climate change is often the kind of trigger that fires the bullet. It's the last straw that pushes ecosystems over the edge. Oftentimes we're not seeing climate change impacts acting independently, but they're acting in concert with other stressors. So for example, populations that are overfished, overharvested, will be at a critical level where they can easily be pushed below the threshold, so that overharvested species are most vulnerable to climate change. We see interactions between pollution stress, sediment runoff stress, and climate change. So it's often the interaction of these stressors that affects populations. So even if we're not able to locally manage for the impacts of climate change, if we can't locally impact sea level rise or temperature change, what we can do is ameliorate a lot of those other human-managed ecosystem impacts and thereby keep the populations going over the edge. And that probably takes less effort than to completely protect an area. So these are the places that I think are most interesting from a scientific viewpoint. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through 3 points. Some of these are probably going to be very familiar, some of these probably won't be. But they point out why I think we need to take this more deterministic basis, this approach that goes beyond generalizations. The first is, we know that obviously climate change is a worldwide phenomenon. It's having impacts all over the world. But what does it mean when we say we have an average increase of about 1 degree? Well, this is a map that shows the range of temperature increases over the surface of the globe. The average surface increase is what we tend to talk about. When we say an increase of 2 degrees C or an increase of 6 degrees C, we're talking about the average temperature of the surface of the globe. If you look at this map, you see changes of minus 6.8 degrees C up to positive 6.6 degrees C at the poles. This graph shows the change as a function of latitude. If you look at equatorial systems, there's comparatively little change. As we move towards the poles, again, as you've undoubtedly heard, once we reduce ice cover, we reduce the reflection of light, we tend to get this positive feedback loop. But the point is that the changes of temperature over the surface of the globe are highly, highly heterogeneous. So if you are in Alaska, you're experiencing a very different rate of change than you are in Ecuador. And in some places, you may actually see very little impacts. This is a graph showing pH changes over the surface of the Earth. And you see the same story. There's some places that are being highly impacted, some places that aren't. But oftentimes when we discuss this, we talk in terms of kind of average increases. So I think people who haven't had the exposure that you have think, well, okay, we're going from a temperature of 86 degrees to 87 degrees, big deal. It's not that simple. We see this high level of heterogeneity. Point number 2, again, is going to be obvious to anybody who's a gardener or a farmer. Organisms all vary in their physiological responses to changes in precipitation, to changes in temperature. All these things that climate change is likely to impact. And as a result of their variable responses to the environment, we see winners and losers. Oftentimes, the winners are things that we hate. They tend to be pest species, they tend to be invasive species, because they have these very broad physiological tolerances. So if they can handle a wide range of conditions, chances are they'll be less affected by changes in the environment. And so, for example, mosquitoes do very well under climate change. Other organisms, like corals that are much more sensitive, don't tend to do very well. What we use to measure these relationships is called a performance curve. And I just want to walk you through this because I think it really drives home how, as biologists, we can contribute to this discussion. So every organism shows a curve that is very similar to this, where below some critical temperature, it's too cold, the tissues freeze, their enzymes stop working, and they die. There's a fairly broad range over which increases in body temperature cause fairly small changes in what we're kind of lumping here as fitness, physiological performance of the body. And then there's this kind of sweet spot. There's a range of temperatures over which they can reproduce, they can live, they're happy. And oftentimes, the difference between this optimal temperature and a region of reproductive failure or death is fairly small. Again, going back to the coral reef example, if we have temperatures that are even a degree or 2 above normal, we're moving from this part of the curve to this part of the curve, where we're going from a region of being optimal to a region of mortality. And every species has a different performance curve. There are a number of ways we can measure this. We can look at whole organism performance. There are a lot of very clever ways of looking at this in terms of biochemical analyses. We can look at protein structures. And this is a lot of where climate change research in the physiological field is heading. Again, this is something that's obvious to anybody who's ever grown a garden. It's been known for millennia. This is just a graph showing the variability in the optimal temperature for vegetative production, the reproductive temperature, things like corn, soybeans, wheat. And it varies from species to species. These are things we've known for a long time, but it has really important implications for how we predict the impacts of climate change. The third point I want to make is not quite so obvious, and that is that we have a very defined way of looking at the world as humans. We make our own metabolic heat. If we get too hot, our pores open up, or we start to sweat and we cool down. If we get too cold, we kick up our internal metabolic machinery and we warm up. So we have very tight control of our internal temperatures. And you all know that if you have a fever more than a couple degrees for any extended period of time, you can end up really in a lot of trouble. For 99% of organisms on Earth, that's not true. They have their temperatures driven by the ambient environment, so they have body temperatures that may be fluctuating by 25 degrees C or more for a couple of hours. And it's driven by a lot of different aspects of weather that we kind of know impact this, but we don't really understand how that impacts other organisms. So when I moved to South Carolina from the West Coast, I heard about the heat index for the first time. And it's this god-awful index of how you combine the effects of relative humidity and temperature to make you feel like you're living in a greenhouse. You're very familiar here, as I'm becoming familiar with wind chill, which is just the opposite, where you've got air temperature and the effect of wind blowing over the surface of your body effectively makes it as if you were in still air at much lower temperature. This is what is impacting organisms on a day-to-day basis. Now, the important thing is that, again, we're talking about climate, but organisms don't care about climate. If you are a little bunny rabbit sitting there, you could care less with the 30-year running averages of climate in your area. What you care about is whether the weather that day or the weather over a period of a couple days is hot enough or cold enough to kill you, or hot enough or cold enough to affect your predators. So the way to kind of think about this is it's climate that trains weather, but it's weather that throws the punches. So as a biologist, we're talking about climate, but what we really care about is weather. We care about how that 30-year running average affects the incidence of these weather conditions, but it's ultimately the weather that drives the responses of the organisms. So this is what we try to do in our research group, is we try to effectively translate what we as humans are experiencing to that of something on the shore, a mussel, a barnacle, a sea star, something that has a completely different kind of viewpoint, if you will, of the way that climate and weather affect organisms. One example of that is what we find is that we talk a lot about air temperature. Air temperature itself is a very poor proxy for the temperature of most animals. Oftentimes what we see is that air temperature will set the lower limit to animal and plant temperature, and then we have solar radiation bringing it well above that. Anybody who's walked on a hot sidewalk on a hot sunny day knows this. If you put your hand on that sidewalk, it's much, much warmer than the surrounding air temperature. I have my students do this. If you measure air temperature in the shade and in the sun, it's just about exactly the same air temperature, but the difference is the amount of heat that's entering your body through solar radiation. So this is key, because when we talk about increases in air temperature, absolutely it affects organisms, but it affects them by setting that lower limit, and then it's solar radiation that heats them, in some cases 10 or 15 degrees above that lower limit. So we have to take all of these factors into account when we look at the impacts of weather on organisms. These are just a bunch of limpets and snails on a rock in Australia in this case. And it's, I'm trying to figure out how to do this without holding the microphone. It's a rock that has two faces about like this, and very, very slight differences in the amount of solar radiation they're receiving, slight differences in the color, so that affects how much sunlight they absorb. And if you look at this infrared picture, what you'll see is we have differences in the temperature of these animals that go from about 30 degrees up to about 40 degrees over the scale of a couple of centimeters from one another. So how then do we get from this little teeny tiny scale, we want to look at something that's commercially important, like an oyster. How do we go from that to these global scale changes that we really need to understand in order to adapt to climate change? What we do is we take a bunch of really deep computer models. We would basically keep track of heat exchange. I'm not going to walk you through this, but all those things that are kind of familiar to you with the kind of effects of wind blowing of your body, solar radiation, even the amount of heat that's conducted. These are all things that you can keep track of pretty easily with Newtonian physics. So we take a wide range of data. We take things like satellite data, we take weather station data, and we translate that into a weather forecast for the organisms we care about. And we've gotten pretty good about this. So it's not the individual pieces of what I just showed you, but it's when you put the three things together that you start getting some absolutely bizarre patterns that you wouldn't otherwise predict. And it's where some of these surprises that I mentioned may emerge. So if it's the weather that drives fitness, and we see these differences in the impacts of weather both due to the physiology and due to things like the microclimate, somehow we have to scale down these very, very large scale predictions to a level that is relevant to the animal and then back up again. So this is what the field of ecological forecasting does. We take these very, very large scale patterns of weather, we put them into computer models, we test them in the field, and then we look at how that impacts the biology of the organism, and then we use those to make maps of risk. This is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to make a map of risk, a weather forecast, if you will, for each of these species of animals and plants that we care about. We use the intertidal zone as a model ecosystem. Anybody who's crawled around the shore is familiar with this. Intertidal zones have served as kind of models for ecological studies for a long time. If you look at organisms that are low in the intertidal, they spend most of their time in water. As you move upwards away from the tide, you have animals that are spending more time in air than they are in water. And so in between you end up with this high gradient in stress. So it really serves as a model ecosystem for looking over a very short spatial scale. As a result, what we also expect is if they're already effectively living about as far in the terrestrial environment as they can, with any increases in stress, probably you're going to start to push some of these animals and plants farther down into the subtidal. And in fact, that's what we're seeing. We're starting to see these mortality events around the world. These are mussels dying in New Zealand. This is kind of a bleach line of algae in Washington State. And these are images of these sea stars that effectively start oozing off the rocks. either when they're getting too hot, or in this case, a combination of getting too hot and having low oxygen conditions. So we're already starting to see these effects. And the question is, how well can we predict them? We do this two different ways. The first is that we use computer models. We keep track of heat exchange, basic physics models. The other way we do it is that we build biomimic sensors. We effectively build little robots that measure the temperature of animals in the field. So these are what we kind of affectionately call robomuscles. The shape and the size of organisms all affect that exchange of heat. It exchanges the movement of wind over its surface. It affects the amount of light that's reflected, and it affects the amount of heat that is conducted from the animal to the ground. And so what we find is if we put these sensors out there without taking the organism into account, we get errors of about 15 degrees C. If we start making loggers, temperature loggers, that mimic the thermal characteristics of the organism in question, we can get to within about 1.5 degrees of the maximum temperatures experienced in the field. So we've now got these things around the world. We have them on just about every continent. We're just now starting to put them in China as well. And what they give us is kind of a muscle's eye view of the world, a muscle's eye view of climate change. And it tells us some things that are very kind of non-intuitive. This is a graph that's showing the maximum temperature along a couple thousand kilometer gradient here from British Columbia down to Southern California. And in the red, you can see kind of the most extreme temperatures, and the blue shows the average extremes. And moving along from south to north, we're not seeing kind of a gradual decrease in stress. We're not seeing things getting hot as we move from the poles to the equator. Rather, we're seeing what we're calling thermal mosaics, where it gets hot, it gets cold, it gets hot, it gets cold, because of the importance of these local factors. So for one example is that at this one site in northern Washington, the low tides during the summer are always occurring right in the middle of the day when the sun is hottest. At some of these sites in Southern California, it's getting very, very hot in the terrestrial environment, but the animals are underwater during the hottest times of the day because of the tide. There are other things like coastal fog, things like wave splash. But the bottom line is that our expectations change of what we should expect to see in nature. We shouldn't expect to just see these kind of simple poleward shifts, but rather we start to see a much more complex story. But we can make some predictions about this. We have some predictive power about where we expect trouble spots to emerge. So it's what we're calling these kind of hot spots, where it's hotter than average based on the latitude, and cold spots where it's colder. And in fact, it's reflected by some physiological measurements, measurements of growth, measurements of reproduction. We can also make predictions of a whole-scale mortality. This is one of the predictions we made in New Zealand, where if you move along the coast, there's this one region where it's getting very hot. What our team did was we went out, made these predictions, went along the coast, and sure enough, if you go out to the areas predicted to be hot, all the, in this case, burrowing urchins were belly up, dead in the sediment. But in the surrounding areas, they were fine. So it gives us some confidence that our ability to make predictions based on this very kind of detailed understanding of how organisms interact with the surrounding world has some merit to it, that it actually does work. So how do we then translate this from something that is completely esoteric and probably mostly scientists care about into something that the rest of the world cares about? How do we take this information and put it into a format that's usable, that's digestible by somebody like a shellfisher? Well, again, without going into the details, we're able to use these engineering models, and then we couple them with what are called dynamic energy budget models. In essence, what it keeps track of is the flow of energy. So an analogy is to think of a flow of water, where this is the energy input, this is the amount of food that the organism is eating. Some of that food has to go into maintaining the organism. Some of it then goes into buckets that can be used for reproduction and used for growth. So if you think of this flow as an analogy for energy flow, and that energy flow is affected by things like salinity, by temperature, by food supply, the kind of things we can predict are things that are relevant to aquaculture, to shellfish growers, to ecologically important species. So we can make predictions about the maximum body size that some of these animals will attain. We can make predictions of growth rate, even kind of meat quality by looking at reproductive output, the number of eggs as a ratio of the amount of body mass, and the time to reproductive maturity. So this is where we can take the science, put it into a format that's usable. But the real challenge then is how do we, rather than hand this down from science to the end users, how do we start at the very end? Scientists are often, as you probably know, very guilty of this kind of loading dock phenomenon, where we collect a lot of data, we put it on a website, and then we whine when nobody uses it. And so finally, a lot of scientists are kind of waking up to the notion that, well, perhaps we got to start with the end user before we start cranking the data, before we start putting this in formats that may or may not be usable. So a project we just started to spin up here, it's only in the planning stages, is we've collaborated with the New England Shellfish Growers Association to ask, how can we make predictions of the impacts of environmental change on growth by mussels and oysters? Can we make explicit predictions that will help guide where farms and collection sites will most likely be impacted, where would they least likely be impacted, and in some cases, when would it be most beneficial to switch from one species to another one? There are a lot of economic analyses that have to go into this. There's a lot of information on how much to invest in the system. But this is a way to actually get science into the decision-making process and into the hands of people who can do something about it. So ultimately, the goal is you don't have to look at the details of this, but the bottom line is that none of this science is done in isolation. It's all done in concert with economic analysis, with sociological information on people's understanding of the impacts of climate change. But it's a way towards this integrated whole where we mix the policy and the science in a way that is ultimately usable and not just kept within the ivory tower. And so with that, I'll stop. I just want to acknowledge a couple of funding sources and all the people who did the actual work and a number of collaborators around the world. Thanks.